The Boötes void is a name given to an unusually low-density region in maps of galaxies located in the direction of the constellation Boötes. The constellation itself is a foreground pattern of Milky Way stars set at distances measured in tens to hundreds of light years. The void lies far beyond where the night sky no longer reads as individual stars and instead becomes a statistical map of galaxies spread across space. The observational frame begins with that separation. The stars of Boötes are a nearby reference on the sky. The Boötes void is a region of the large-scale universe identified by a shortage of luminous galaxies across a broad patch of that same sky direction, over a particular range of distances. Those distances are not measured by tape or parallax. They're inferred from redshift surveys. A galaxy spectrum contains features whose wavelengths shift toward the red as the universe expands. The size of the shift provides a measure of recession, and under the standard expansion relation at these scales, a measure of distance. When a survey collects positions on the sky and redshifts for many galaxies, it creates a three-dimensional point cloud in what is called redshift space. In that space, dense regions appear as filaments and sheets where points cluster. Under dense regions appear as cavities where points are sparse. The Boötes void is one such cavity. Its prominence comes from the fact that it appears large in angular extent and deep in the deficit of bright galaxy traces in the nearby universe. To map the void, observers begin with a chosen survey catalogue. Every catalogue has a footprint, meaning the portion of the sky it covers, and it has selection limits, meaning which galaxies are included reliably. In practice, optical surveys are limited by apparent brightness, and by how well a galaxy stands out from the background sky. A survey that is complete to a certain brightness will detect bright galaxies at greater distances than faint galaxies. This means the raw catalogue changes character with distance. Nearby it contains both bright and faint systems. Farther away it contains mostly bright systems. Because a void is defined by a deficit, this change must be controlled. One common approach is to define a volume-limited sample, choose a maximum distance, then choose a minimum intrinsic luminosity, such that any galaxy brighter than that would be detectable throughout the chosen volume. This yields a uniform tracer set whose density can be compared across space without a built-in radial fade. Within that observational frame, the Boötes void is described by three linked coordinates. First is direction on the sky, a broad region in Boötes. Second is distance defined by a range of redshifts. Third is the three-dimensional shape that results when those directions and distances are combined. The void is not a perfect sphere. It is a region in which the density of the chosen traces drops below the average, surrounded by a boundary zone, where density rises back toward the cosmic web. Different analyses set different thresholds for what counts as low density, and different analyses use different tracer selections so the precise boundary can shift. The stable point is that the region remains under dense in luminous galaxy maps compared with its surroundings. The apparent scale of the Boötes void is often expressed in everyday distance language, such as hundreds of millions of light-years across. That language can hide two separate choices, whether the scale refers to the deepest core or to a broader connected under density, and whether it refers to a diameter defined by an effective radius or by the largest empty sphere. A catalogue can support more than one definition. In a maximal sphere approach, the mapping focuses on the larger spheres that can be placed in the galaxy distribution, without enclosing a tracer galaxy, above the chosen brightness threshold. The largest such sphere marks an emptiest region, a core. In a connected region approach, the mapping begins with a smooth density field, and then identifies connected regions below a threshold. This can produce a larger, more complex shape that includes multiple basins linked by low-density corridors. A watershed approach treats the density field like terrain with basins and ridges, and can yield a hierarchy in which the Boötes region contains smaller sub-voids that can be merged at a higher level. Each method is a valid observational construction. Each yields a slightly different answer to the question of where the void begins and ends. The mapping also depends on how redshift space is handled. Redshift provides distance, but it also includes a galaxy's peculiar velocity, its motion relative to the average expansion. In dense regions, peculiar velocities can be large within groups and clusters, stretching structures along the line of sight in redshift space. In under-dense regions, coherent outflows can also shift positions. For mapping the void's location, the most practical stance is that the void is defined in redshift space because the survey is measured that way. The boundary and interior are then consistent with the measurement frame. When comparisons are made to simulations, the simulations are often converted into the same redshift space frame, so the same distortions apply. This keeps the definition stable even when real space would differ slightly. A complete observational frame includes the survey mask. No survey observes every direction equally. Bright foreground stars, instrument limits, and observing strategy create patches where data are missing or shallower. A void can be exaggerated if a missing patch is treated as empty space. The mapping of Boötes is regarded as physically real, in part because it persists across different survey efforts and different observing strategies. Even so, the precise shape and the apparent sharpness of its boundaries can be influenced by variations in depth. A careful map uses completeness corrections such as random catalogues that represent the expected sampling pattern, and uses void-finding algorithms that account for edges rather than allowing voids to spill into unobserved regions. Within the chosen frame, the void's location can be described as a region in which the number density of tracer galaxies is substantially below the mean for that sample, sustained across a large spatial volume. The surrounding cosmic web provides contrast. On the sky, the boundary is not visible as a line. It is visible in 3 dimensions as a rise in galaxy counts and a change in clustering strength. Observers often visualize this by slicing the survey volume into thin slabs in distance and plotting galaxies in each slab. In such slices, the Boötes region can show a noticeably sparse interior. Another visualization plots galaxies in a wedge diagram where angle and distance are displayed together. In wedge diagrams, voids appear as hollow regions bounded by arc like concentrations of galaxies on the near and far sides. These views are not separate realities. They are projections of the same 3-dimensional catalogue. In this mapping context, the phrase disturbing surprise is not yet a claim about physics. It is a claim about what the map seems to show. Before any interpretation, the observational frame must be fixed, so that the surprise is anchored to a specific volume and a specific tracer definition. Without that, a surprise can shift with the catalogue with the magnitude cut and with the void finder. With the frame fixed, the Boötes void becomes a defined region in redshift space, in a defined sky footprint measured by a defined tracer sample, surrounded by a defined local web of walls and filaments that sets the contrast. This is the outermost layer of the story. It is the geometry and the measurement scaffolding. The next step is to remain within this scaffolding and describe how voids are defined, and how boundaries are drawn in a way that can be repeated and compared, because the stability of any later claim depends on the stability of the definition. A void is not an object with a visible surface. It is an inference made from the distribution of tracers, and the rules used to make that inference determine what counts as inside, what counts as outside, and what counts as the core. The next inward region is therefore the definition process itself, because the phrase disturbing surprise often arises when a void is treated as if it were uniquely defined, while in practice several defensible definitions coexist. In a region as large as Boötes, small changes in definition can move boundaries by tens of millions of light-years, and can change whether a given galaxy absorber or structure is described as deep inside or merely near the edge. The most basic ingredient is tracer choice. A tracer is a set of galaxies selected by some criterion such as intrinsic brightness, stellar mass color, or emission line strength. Bright galaxies are rare and clustered. Faint galaxies are more numerous and extend into lower density regions. Therefore, voids defined by bright galaxies appear larger and deeper than voids defined by fainter galaxies. This is not a contradiction. It is a consequence of bias, the tendency of certain galaxy types to trace higher density peaks more strongly. If Boötes is defined by bright galaxies, its interior can look almost empty. If it is defined by a deeper sample including dwarfs, the interior can show more points and more internal structure. Both maps refer to the same underlying mass field, but they emphasize different parts of the tracer relationship. Any definition step must therefore state what the tracer is, and whether the sample is volume limited so that tracer density is not simply declining with distance. Once tracers are chosen, one must choose a density estimator. A point cloud of galaxies is not a smooth field. To define under dense regions, one constructs an estimate of the local number density. A grid-based method counts galaxies in three-dimensional cells and smooths the result. A kernel method places a smoothing kernel around each galaxy and sums contributions. A nearest neighbor method estimates density from the distance to a fixed number of nearest galaxies. A tessellation method partitions space into cells around each galaxy, with cell volume inversely related to density. Each method behaves differently in sparse regions. In the deep interior of Boötes, where galaxy separations can be large, nearest neighbor methods can become noisy and can fluctuate strongly from one location to the next. Grid methods can depend on cell size, and overly small cells can be empty by chance, while overly large cells can blur boundary structure. Tessellation methods can adapt to density, but require careful treatment of survey edges and masks. Therefore, the density estimator is part of the void definition, not a neutral preprocessing step. With the density field in hand, a common void definition uses a threshold. One chooses a threshold such as a fraction of the mean density of the tracer sample. Regions below that threshold are identified, and connected components are labelled as voids. This approach can be intuitive, but it is sensitive to the threshold. A stricter threshold yields smaller, deeper voids. A looser threshold yields larger, shallower connected under-densities which can merge neighbouring basins. In Boötes, a looser threshold can connect multiple under-dense pockets into a single named void. A stricter threshold can isolate a deepest core. This matters for narrative because a disturbing surprise often relies on the idea that the void is a single coherent region. In fact, it can be a merged structure with internal ridges and subvoids. If an object is found in one subbasin, describing it as being in the center of the entire merged void may be misleading. A careful definition step therefore distinguishes between the core region and the broader, under-dense complex. Another widely used definition approach is maximal spheres. Here one searches for spheres that contain no tracer galaxies above the selected threshold. The largest sphere defines a core emptiness scale. Additional spheres can be found and merged, producing a void region. This method emphasizes the emptiest part of space in a geometric way. It has advantages for communicating emptiness, but it also has limitations. A complex-shaped void can be poorly represented by spheres. A sphere can avoid galaxies by shifting slightly, even if the region is not uniformly underdense. In a sparse catalogue, the largest sphere can be set by a chance configuration of points. Therefore, maximal sphere results are most meaningful when they are compared to mock catalogues that replicate tracer density and selection, so that the distribution of maximal sphere sizes under the model is known. A watershed approach defines voids as basins in the density field. Local minima are identified, then basins are grown outward until they meet at ridges. This method naturally captures irregular shapes and provides a hierarchy. Small basins can merge into larger basins at higher levels. For Boötes, a watershed approach can reveal that the named region is a higher-level basin comprising several sub-basins. This is valuable because it clarifies internal structure. It also means that the phrase "looked into the Boötes void" can refer to different regions depending on whether one means the deepest sub-basin or the broader, merged basin. In a watershed catalogue, each basin has a centre defined by a minimum point, while the merged basin has a centre defined by a volume-weighted centroid. These centres can differ significantly, affecting radial profiles and membership. Definition also involves handling the survey boundary. In observational data, the void cannot be defined beyond the surveyed region. If the density field is estimated without properly accounting for the mask, the algorithm can interpret unobserved regions as empty and extend voids into them. Therefore, void finding in surveys often includes buffer particles or boundary conditions that prevent voids from crossing the mask. Alternatively, density estimators incorporate the selection function and random catalogues. This step is critical for Boötes because the void covers a large region. The void's apparent size can be biased if its outline approaches survey edges. A robust definition demonstrates that the void's core and much of its boundary are well within observed regions, and that the void persists under different survey subsets. When an anomaly is claimed, definition sensitivity becomes a diagnostic. If the disturbing surprise is said to be located deep inside the void, one asks whether it remains deep inside under multiple definitions and traces. If it moves toward the boundary under reasonable choices, then the surprise is likely a boundary phenomenon such as a filament intrusion, rather than a core phenomenon. If it remains in low-density environment under local density measures regardless of global boundary, it is more robust. This is why local density estimators are often used alongside void membership. A galaxy can be labelled as a void core galaxy if both its global membership and its local density are low. In a calm interpretation, the void definition step does not undermine the reality of Boötes. It refines what can be claimed. Boötes is a large underdensity in galaxy traces, but its exact extent and core depend on tracer selection density, estimation thresholding, and survey mask handling. Any disturbing surprise must therefore be described in the language of these definitions. It must specify the tracer sample, the void finder, the completeness limits, and the membership criteria. Only then can a model comparison be made, because simulations must apply the same definition to be comparable. Without this, the surprise is partly a semantic shift, and scientific confusion is the predictable result of analysts working with different boundaries and different baselines. With definitions set as the necessary foundation, the next inward step is to define what disturbing surprise means as a testable statement. That means translating the phrase into specific observables, such as a mass deficit inferred from dynamics that is inconsistent with tracer density, a pattern of gas absorption that implies unexpected enrichment, or a galaxy population that violates expected abundance relationships under matched selection. This translation is the point where narrative becomes measurement. A disturbing surprise in the Boötes void becomes scientifically meaningful only when it is expressed as a specific measurable deviation from a predicted distribution under a matched observational definition. The next inward region is therefore the translation from narrative to metrics, because words like disturbing and surprise do not specify what is being measured, what baseline is being used, or what level of deviation would qualify as confusion rather than ordinary scatter. In a void where sample sizes are small and selection effects are strong, this translation is especially important. A surprise that is not defined precisely can be generated by completeness limits, by boundary shifts, or by the natural existence of rare outcomes in large surveys. The first step is to state the object of surprise. In void discussions, the object typically falls into one of 5 categories. It can be the void's apparent emptiness, meaning the number density of galaxies above a defined threshold is far lower than expected. It can be an interior structure, meaning the void appears to contain a coherent filament wall or group that seems too rich for the environment. It can be the presence of one or more unusual galaxies, such as a massive system or a galaxy, with extreme properties in what is claimed to be the deep core. It can be an intergalactic gas signature, such as unexpectedly strong absorption or unexpectedly high metal enrichment along sightlines through the core. Or it can be a gravitational or dynamical signature such as a lensing or redshift space distortion pattern that implies a mass deficit inconsistent with the galaxy-defined profile. Each category implies different measurements and different baselines. Without choosing the category, the phrase disturbing surprise is only an invitation to disagreement. The second step is to fix the measurement definition. For emptiness, this means choosing a tracer sample and a volume definition. A volume-limited sample sets a maximum redshift and a minimum intrinsic luminosity. Within that volume, one measures galaxy number density in the void core and compares it to the mean density in the same survey. One also measures the void's effective radius and profile. For internal structure, this means defining a statistic for filament richness, such as the number of galaxies per unit length of an identified internal spine, or the clustering strength within the void interior compared to mock catalogues. For unusual galaxies, this means defining what unusual means, such as stellar mass above a threshold gas fraction, above a threshold metallicity, below a threshold or star formation rate, above a threshold for a given mass, and specifying how those quantities are measured and calibrated. For gas signatures, it means defining absorber detection thresholds, column density limits, ion selection, and ionization modeling assumptions. For gravitational and dynamical signatures, it means defining the lensing estimator or the redshift space distortion statistic and how covariance is estimated. The third step is to define the baseline. In void work, the baseline should rarely be a verbal expectation. It should be a distribution derived from mock observations. The mocks begin with a simulation that reproduces the large-scale mass field under the standard cosmological model. Galaxies are added through a method that reproduces overall clustering and luminosity functions. The mock is then cut by the same survey footprint magnitude limits, completeness patterns, and redshift errors. The same void finder is applied. The same statistic is measured. This yields a distribution of outcomes under the model for the exact measurement. An anomaly is then a value in the tail of that distribution, beyond what the survey volume and the look elsewhere effect would allow, with reasonable probability. The important point is that the baseline must match both cosmology and measurement. Otherwise, a mismatch can be created by comparing different definitions. The fourth step is to set a threshold for surprise. In statistical terms, one must decide what level of tail probability is considered meaningful, given the number of trials implicit in the survey and analysis. A structure that is 1 in 1,000 under a typical distribution may still be expected if the survey effectively contains thousands of independent regions, and if the void is chosen as the most prominent. Therefore, a disturbing surprise that implies model failure requires a stronger statement that under the model and measurement pipeline, a Boötes-like outcome would be so rare that the expected number in the survey is much less than 1. Even then, uncertainty in modelling must be considered, especially in the baryonic layer. If the surprise concerns galaxy properties, model uncertainty may dominate, so the threshold for claiming model failure should be higher. In practice, many surprises become better framed as constraints on model parameters rather than as contradictions. The fifth step is to separate mass-level surprises from tracer-level surprises. An emptiness surprise in bright galaxies is often a tracer-level surprise and can be expected because bright galaxies are biased and rare in voids. A mass-level surprise would involve evidence that the mass deficit itself is deeper or larger than expected. This requires mass-sensitive probes such as lensing or dynamics. Therefore, a disturbing surprise that aims at cosmological implications must be tied to mass. If it is tied only to galaxy counts, it is more likely to be a statement about halo occupation and galaxy formation efficiency in low-mass halos. To make this concrete without adopting a specific claim prematurely, one can outline examples of how surprise becomes a test. If the surprise is that the void is too empty, the test is to measure the void's galaxy density profile in a volume-limited sample and compare to MOCs accounting for the look elsewhere effect. If the surprise is that there is a rich group deep in the core, the test is to verify its distance and environment estimate its halo mass, and compare the occurrence of such a group in void interiors in MOCs. If the surprise is that void gas is metal, enriched, the test is to measure absorber metallicities along multiple core sightlines, search deeply for associated galaxies, and compare the absorber statistics to simulations with ionization modeling. If the surprise is that the void's dynamics imply an unexpectedly deep mass deficit, the test is to fit redshift space distortions, with bias and asphericity modeled, and compare to MOC predictions, then seek lensing confirmation. A disturbing surprise can also be defined as a mismatch between two measurements that should be consistent under the model. For example, if galaxy counts suggest a certain depth, while dynamics suggest a much deeper or much shallower mass deficit, that inconsistency can be a surprise even if each measurement alone is within expected scatter. Such cross-checks are powerful because they can reveal hidden systematics or real, physical differences. Yet they also require careful covariance modeling because the measurements are not independent. When this translation is done, confusion becomes less dramatic. Confusion becomes a structured set of questions. Is the void boundary defined consistently? Is the tracer complete? Is the claimed feature robust to definition changes? Is the baseline matched through MOCs? Is the deviation large enough given cosmic variance and the look elsewhere effect? Is the surprise in mass in galaxies or in gas? These questions do not reduce interest. They define a path for measurement. With the surprise translated into metrics, the next inward step is to examine survey limits and missing light. Because in a void, the most common source of apparent surprise is that the catalogue does not represent all galaxies present. Magnitude limit surface brightness bias and redshift incompleteness can create both emptiness and apparent extremes in the detected population. Understanding these limits is necessary before any metric can be interpreted as a physical deviation. Survey limits are not a background detail in void work. They are an active sculptor of what the void looks like and of what kinds of objects are available to be called surprising. The next inward region is therefore the set of observational constraints that can make the Boötes void appear emptier than it is, or can make the small number of detected objects look unusually extreme. In a sparse environment, incompleteness is amplified. Missing a modest number of faint galaxies can change inferred density by a large fraction. Selecting only the most detectable galaxies can make the remaining sample seem abnormal. Understanding these effects is the first requirement for separating a disturbing physical surprise from a disturbing artifact of measurement. The most familiar limitation is the flux limit. Optical surveys detect objects above a threshold in apparent brightness. At greater distances, the same intrinsic luminosity produces less apparent flux, so fewer galaxies are detectable. If one uses a raw flux limited catalogue, the apparent number density of galaxies declines with redshift, creating a radial gradient that can be mistaken for a void, or can distort the void's boundary. The standard mitigation is to build volume-limited samples, choosing a maximum distance and an intrinsic luminosity threshold that ensures completeness across that volume. This stabilizes density comparisons, but at a cost. The threshold is typically bright enough that only relatively luminous galaxies remain, and luminous galaxies are strongly biased tracers. In a void, they can be nearly absent. Therefore, a volume-limited bright sample can make the Boötes interior look dramatically empty, even if a population of faint galaxies exists. This is not necessarily wrong. It is a correct statement about that tracer population. The mistake is to translate it into a statement about all galaxies or about mass without further evidence. Surface brightness bias is often more important than flux limit in void interiors. Two galaxies with the same total luminosity can have very different detectability depending on how spread out their light is. Detection pipelines rely on contrast against the night sky background, which includes scattered light air glow and instrument noise. A diffuse galaxy can fall below detection even if its total flux is above the nominal threshold. Low surface brightness galaxies are therefore systematically undercounted. In void environments, such systems may be relatively common, because star formation can be extended and low intensity, producing faint disks and diffuse stellar distributions. If the Boötes interior hosts many low surface brightness galaxies, a standard survey can miss them, exaggerating emptiness and biasing the detected sample toward compact or actively star-forming systems. This can generate a disturbing surprise narrative if the few detected galaxies appear unusually bright, unusually gas-rich, or unusually active because the faint diffuse population that would provide context is missing. Redshift incompleteness adds a second layer. Even when galaxies are detected in imaging, measuring a redshift requires successful spectroscopy. Spectroscopy can fail for faint and diffuse galaxies because spectra have low signal. Emission lines may be weak. Absorption features may be hard to detect. In addition, many surveys have mechanical constraints that limit how many spectra can be obtained in crowded regions, though this is less of a problem in void interiors. The main void-relevant issue is that faint and low surface brightness systems can be underrepresented in the redshift catalogue. In a three-dimensional map, galaxies without redshifts are effectively absent. This can create holes and can deepen voids artificially. Modern surveys often quantify redshift success rates and apply weights, but weights assume that failures are random within categories. If failures correlate with surface brightness and with void environments, corrections can be imperfect. A robust void analysis therefore either uses a sample with high redshift success across the relevant galaxy types, or performs targeted follow-up in void regions to fill in missing redshifts. Non-uniform depth across the survey footprint can also mimic or amplify a void. Imaging depth varies with observing conditions, exposure time, and instrument. If one region of the sky is observed more shallowly, fewer galaxies are detected and an apparent underdensity can appear. Spectroscopic completeness can also vary with time and location. For a large structure like Boötes, which spans a wide sky area, it is essential to verify that the region's low density persists when depth variations are accounted for. This is typically done using completeness masks and random catalogues that encode where galaxies could have been observed. If the void boundary aligns with a depth change that raises suspicion, if it does not, and if the void appears in independent surveys with different observing strategies, confidence increases. Foreground extinction from Milky Way dust can dim background galaxies, reducing detectability. Dust extinction varies with sky position. Surveys correct for extinction using dust maps, but residual errors can remain. Extinction alone is unlikely to create a void on the scale of Boötes, but it can contribute to subtle gradients that affect faint galaxy counts. Bright stars can also produce scattered light and halos that obscure faint objects locally. These effects can create small-scale holes. In a sparse region, small holes can appear more significant. Proper masking and the use of survey systematics maps help mitigate these issues. Alternative tracers reveal what optical catalogues miss. Neutral hydrogen surveys detect gas-rich galaxies even when optical light is faint. In voids where interactions and stripping are weak, low-mass galaxies can retain gas. Therefore, a radio survey can find galaxies that optical surveys miss, changing the perceived census. Yet radio surveys also have biases. They miss gas-poor galaxies and can miss low-gas mass dwarfs at large distances. Ultraviolet surveys detect young stars and can reveal low-level star formation, but ultraviolet background subtraction and dust corrections can be challenging. Infrared surveys detect dust emission, but void galaxies can have low dust content. Each tracer provides a partial view. A complete interpretation of Boötes requires combining tracers and acknowledging what each can and cannot see. Survey limits also shape the interpretation of gas absorption. Detecting weak absorbers requires high signal-to-noise spectra of background sources. If spectra are shallow, only strong absorbers are detected, creating the impression that absorbers in the void are stronger than they truly are on average. Similarly, measuring metallicity requires detecting multiple ions. Without them, metallicity estimates can be biased by ionization assumptions. Therefore, an apparent surprise in absorption can be a detection threshold artifact. The practical outcome of this layer is a set of checks that should accompany any disturbing surprise claim. The void's emptiness should be measured in a sample with well-quantified completeness. Low surface brightness sensitivity should be assessed. Redshift completeness should be checked. Survey depth and masks should be mapped. Alternative tracers should be consulted to see whether a hidden population is present. When these checks are done, the void may remain underdense, but the degree of emptiness and the nature of interior objects can change. Many surprises soften into expectations once hidden populations are considered. With survey limits established, the next inward step is to describe the cosmic web around Boötes, because the void's contrast and its boundary structures provide the most reliable local baseline. The surrounding walls and filaments are better sampled and less sensitive to incompleteness. They also shape the void's dynamics and can intrude inward, creating internal features that might be mistaken for core surprises. The Boötes void is framed by the surrounding cosmic web, and that web is both the source of the void's contrast and the reference against which any interior surprise must be measured. The next inward region is therefore the rim of the void, the walls and filaments that outline it, because a void is not a standalone cavity. It is one basin in a connected network of overdensities and underdensities. The boundary is where the story of emptiness becomes a story of structure. Thin sheets of galaxies, elongated filaments and denser nodes that define where matter is collected relative to the underdense interior. Understanding the rim clarifies what is normal for such a void, and what would truly be disturbing if found deep inside. In the standard picture of large-scale structure galaxies, trace a cosmic web shaped by gravity. The web consists of filaments, sheets, and nodes. Filaments are elongated structures where matter has collapsed along two directions, but remains extended along the third, channeling gas and galaxies toward denser nodes. Sheets are broader planar structures separating adjacent underdense basins. Nodes are the intersections where clusters and rich groups form. Around a large void, these elements appear as the boundary region where density rises. The void is therefore not bounded by a smooth shell, but by an irregular arrangement of web features whose thickness and prominence vary with direction. Some directions from the void center encounter a strong filament quickly, while others open into a more diffuse boundary. This irregularity matters because it shapes the void's perceived size and its profile. If one measures the void radius as the distance to the boundary in different directions, the radius varies. An effective radius averages over this variation. A maximal empty sphere defines a core emptiness scale that often sits within the broad underdense region, away from strong boundary intrusions. In Boötes, the named void likely corresponds to a broad underdense complex whose rim is composed of multiple filaments and walls at varying distances. This makes the void feel large because the underdensity extends across many directions before the density returns to typical levels. It also makes boundary definition sensitive to the tracer sample. Bright galaxies strongly populate the filaments and nodes, but can be sparse in weak sheets, making the boundary appear sharper in some directions and less defined in others. The rim also carries the dynamical imprint of void evolution. matter flows away from the interior and toward denser regions. This flow tends to build up density near the boundary, producing what is sometimes described as a compensation ridge. In a perfectly isolated, symmetric void, one might imagine a ring or shell of enhanced density. In reality, the ridge manifests as strengthened filaments and walls near the boundary. Whether the void is compensated in mass depends on the larger scale environment. If the void is embedded in a broader underdensity, the ridge may not fully compensate. If it is embedded in a more typical environment, the ridge can be stronger. For Boötes, the surrounding web suggests some boundary enhancement, but the degree to which the mass deficit is compensated is a measurable question, linked to dynamics and lensing, rather than to galaxy counts alone. Boundary structures influence the interpretation of interior objects by creating intrusions. Filaments can extend inward like tendrils of the web penetrating into the underdense region. A galaxy or a small group on such an intrusion can be geometrically inside the void boundary, while still residing in a locally higher density environment. This is expected in simulations and is part of the baseline interior texture. If such a system is described as a disturbing surprise simply because it appears inside the void, the description may be misleading. The correct question is whether the system is in the void core defined by low local density, or whether it is on a filamentary intrusion. This can be tested by measuring the density field at different smoothing scales and by examining the connectivity of nearby galaxies. A truly core object will lack nearby neighbours over large scales. An intrusion object will often have a chain of neighbours leading back toward the boundary. The rim also provides the cleanest local comparison sample for galaxy properties. Galaxies in filaments and walls near the void are at the same distances as void galaxies, so they share observational biases. Comparing void and rim galaxies matched in stellar mass and in detection limits allows one to isolate environmental effects. If void galaxies are more gas-rich, more star-forming or lower metallicity that can be quantified. If a claim of disturbing surprise involves void galaxies behaving unlike any galaxies in the surrounding web, that difference should be demonstrated relative to this local baseline, rather than to a generic galaxy population at different distances. Gas physics differs across the rim as well. Filaments and walls contain denser gas and more galaxies, making them more enriched in heavy elements. Absorption lines toward background sources are expected to be stronger and more frequent near the rim than in the core. Therefore, claims of unusually strong absorption in the core must be compared to rim sightlines. If core absorption resembles rim absorption, one must explain how dense or enriched gas exists in the core, whether through internal filaments, hidden galaxies, or long-range transport of metals. If core absorption is weak that supports the baseline expectation, the rim thus anchors interpretation of gas signatures. The rim's geometry also affects redshift space distortions. The void outflow field influences galaxies near the boundary and just outside. The surrounding web's mass concentrations can add tidal influences, producing anisotropic flows. In a single void, these environmental effects can be substantial. A simple spherical model may not capture them. Therefore, when dynamics are used to infer mass deficit, the rim's structure and nearby overdensities must be considered. A perceived dynamic anomaly can arise if an aspherical void is fitted with a spherical model. Understanding the rim helps in selecting appropriate models and in choosing directions where measurements are less contaminated. In a calm framing, the rim of Boötes is not merely a border. It is the evidence of how the void formed and a key part of how it should be interpreted. It defines contrast, provides comparison samples, and supplies the boundary conditions for dynamics and gas flow. Many supposed surprises inside a void become less disturbing when it is recognized that the interior is not isolated, but threaded by weak structures connected to the rim. A genuine surprise would be one that remains core deep under multiple definitions and remains inconsistent with the patterns seen at the rim and with the baseline predictions for void interiors. With the rim mapped conceptually, the next inward step is to explain how a giant void forms within the standard framework, because formation history sets expectations for internal substructure, and for how merged basins can create large, under-dense complexes. This formation baseline will clarify whether Boötes should be regarded as a single cavity or as a composite structure, and it will set the stage for evaluating whether any interior feature is truly disturbing or simply part of the expected texture of a matured void. A giant void forms without special rules. It emerges from the same gravitational growth that builds clusters and filaments, but it does so by starting in a place where the initial density is slightly below average, and then evolving as matter flows away. The next inward region is therefore the formation of a large underdensity like the Boötes void, within the standard picture of cosmic structure, because formation history explains why a void can be both enormous and still internally structured, and why a void can look more dramatic in galaxies than it is in mass. It also explains why a feature described as a disturbing surprise might simply be a remnant of how voids merge and mature. In the early universe, matter is close to uniform with small variations. These variations are often described statistically as a field with peaks and troughs. A region that begins slightly below the average density has less gravitational pull than its surroundings. As time passes, surrounding regions that are slightly above average draw matter inward more effectively. In relative terms, matter leaves the underdense region moving toward the forming filaments and nodes. This is not a sudden evacuation. It is a slow drift over billions of years. The result is an increasing contrast between the underdense interior and the denser cosmic web around it. In simulations, voids are therefore not rare. They fill much of the volume. What is rare is an unusually large and deep void defined by a specific tracer within a specific survey volume. A useful way to think about void formation is in terms of differential expansion. The universe expands everywhere, but over dense regions resist expansion locally, because gravity slows them and can reverse their expansion into collapse. Underdense regions do not resist as strongly. Their internal separations grow more freely with the overall expansion, and matter within them experiences a net acceleration outward relative to the mean. Over time, this creates a coherent outflow from the interior toward the boundary. The boundary is where matter that is leaving the interior becomes part of the growing web. It helps build filaments and walls. This boundary growth is not a smooth shell, but it increases the prominence of structures around the void compared with earlier times. The boundary also becomes the place where the gradient in density is strongest, which is why the boundary region dominates many measurements of void dynamics. A large void can arise through two main pathways, and the distinction between them is crucial for interpreting what might look like a disturbing surprise. One pathway is a coherent large-scale underdensity, present from the beginning, a region that is below average on a scale large enough that it evolves into a single dominant basin. In that case, the void's interior can be relatively smooth on large scales, though still textured by smaller fluctuations. The other pathway is merging. The density field contains many basins separated by modest ridges. As structure grows, ridges between neighbouring underdense basins can become less significant compared to the surrounding higher density network. Basins can connect through low-density corridors, and a void finder can merge them into a single larger region under a chosen threshold. In this pathway, a giant void can be a composite, a connected complex of sub-voids. It can have internal seams, weak filaments, and residual walls that mark older boundaries that never fully disappear in the mass field. In galaxy maps, these seams can be faint or intermittent, because galaxy formation is suppressed in low-density regions. This is one way a void can look like a huge clean cavity, even though the underlying mass field contains a subtle internal web. This merging behavior matters because it changes what should be expected inside. If Boötes is a merged complex, then internal substructure is not a surprise. Weak internal filaments, sparse chains of galaxies, and small groups along these filaments are baseline features. Even a denser-looking thread can be a remnant ridge within the merged complex, not an intrusion that violates the void concept. A disturbing surprise narrative can arise when a feature is compared to an imagined perfectly empty sphere rather than to a merged basin with internal texture. The correct baseline is that a large void is not a bubble carved out of the universe. It is the low end of a continuous field shaped into a basin with gentle slopes and internal ripples. Formation also explains why galaxy-defined voids can be more dramatic than mass-defined voids. Galaxies do not trace mass uniformly. Bright galaxies in particular prefer dense environments. Their host halos are massive and form more readily in peaks than in troughs. In a void interior, the halo mass function shifts toward low masses. High-mass halos become extremely rare. Therefore, when a void is defined by bright galaxies, the interior can look almost empty because the tracer is missing even when low-mass halos remain. The mass deficit is real, but it is typically less extreme than the luminous deficit. This is why a large void can be visually striking in a bright galaxy map without implying that the region lacks matter to the same degree. This is also why a reported disturbing surprise must be clear about whether it is a surprise in the distribution of galaxies or in the distribution of mass. The growth history of halos inside the void further amplifies this tracer effect. In under-dense regions, halos accrete matter more slowly. Their merger rates are lower. Their concentrations and assembly histories can differ from halos in filaments. Many halos remain small. Gas accretion into these halos is affected by the ionizing ultraviolet background, which keeps intergalactic gas warm and suppresses accretion into the smallest halos. Feedback from supernovae can expel gas from shallow potentials. These processes reduce the number of halos that host luminous galaxies and reduce star formation efficiency in those that do. The outcome is a void interior populated by a sparse set of mostly low-mass galaxies, often gas-rich and still-forming stars at low levels, embedded in a larger population of faint or dark halos. In this context, the absence of bright galaxies is expected, and the presence of a few faint galaxies is expected, and the presence of internal weak structure is expected. Formation also sets expectations for the void's profile. A void is not defined only by its interior density, but by how density rises toward the boundary. The outflow from the interior and the accumulation of matter near the edges can produce a ridge sometimes called compensation. Whether the ridge is strong depends on the larger scale environment. If the void sits inside a broader underdensity, the ridge may be weak, and the void may be undercompensated, meaning the mass deficit is not balanced by an overdense shell nearby. If the void is more isolated within an otherwise typical region, the ridge can be stronger. This matters because ridge strength influences dynamics and can influence how voids appear in redshift space. For Boötes, the surrounding web provides the observable rim, but the degree of mass compensation remains something that must be inferred, not assumed. If a claim of disturbing surprise involves unusually strong outflow velocities or unusually sharp boundaries, ridge strength and environment are part of the baseline explanation. Another formation-related feature is anisotropy. The cosmic web is not symmetric, so voids are not symmetric. Growth proceeds differently along different directions influenced by nearby overdensities. This can elongate voids and can create preferential directions for internal filaments. In redshift surveys, anisotropy can be further shaped by redshift space distortions. For a named void, this means that simple spherical pictures can be misleading. A void can have a large effective radius while having closer boundaries in some directions and more open directions in others. A feature that seems to sit deep inside along one axis might be closer to a boundary along another axis. Formation predicts such irregularity. Therefore, part of the discipline of void interpretation is to treat distance to boundary as a function of direction rather than as a single number. Within this formation framework, the disturbing surprise suggested by looking into Boötes is most plausibly a surprise created by mismatched intuition. A bright galaxy map can make the region appear almost empty. Then the discovery of any internal structure can feel disturbing, as if something should not be there. Formation history says otherwise. A large void forms by the growth and merging of underdense basins. It should contain a diluted web of dark matter, a sparse set of low-mass halos and occasional internal filaments. The surprise becomes meaningful only when it is not merely the presence of structure, but the quantitative mismatch in how much structure exists, how massive it is, how enriched the gas is, or how strong the dynamics are compared to the baseline distributions from simulations under matched definitions. With formation described from the outside in the next inward step is to set the baseline interior expectations, explicitly separating what is expected for halos for diffuse gas and for galaxies under the same observational frame used to define the void. That baseline is the reference against which any claimed disturbing feature can be evaluated without exaggeration. The baseline interior of a large void is not emptiness but dilution, a lower density version of the same cosmic ingredients found elsewhere, with the visible layer thinning most strongly. The next inward region is therefore the expected contents of the Boötes interior, stated as a 3-layer baseline dark matter halos, and the diluted web diffuse gas in the intergalactic medium, and the sparse galaxy population that forms within the available halos. This baseline is what a disturbing surprise must exceed or contradict. If the claimed surprise lies within it, the proper interpretation is that the void is behaving normally under the standard framework, and the surprise is a mismatch between intuition and tracer selection. If the claimed surprise persists beyond it, then the mismatch becomes a quantitative problem for modelling and measurement. At the mass layer, the baseline is that the void contains less matter than average, but still contains a connected dark matter network. In simulations, the cosmic web extends everywhere, but in voids its filaments are thinner and its density contrasts are weaker. The void interior is dominated by underdense regions, yet small-scale fluctuations remain. This means low-mass halos still form. Their abundance is reduced relative to average density regions, and the abundance of high-mass halos is reduced far more strongly. The halo mass function is shifted toward lower masses. This is a stable prediction across models because it reflects the dependence of halo formation on the local density environment. For Boötes, this implies that halos capable of hosting luminous galaxies are rare, and halos capable of hosting rich groups or clusters are extremely rare in the deepest parts. It also implies that there can be many halos below the threshold where star formation becomes efficient. Many of these halos may host very faint galaxies or none at all. Therefore, the absence of galaxies is not equivalent to the absence of halos. A void can contain gravitational structure that is not seen in light. The spatial distribution of halos in the void is also structured. Halos preferentially reside along faint internal filaments and near residual ridges between subbasins. This produces an interior that can contain sparse chains or small associations of halos. In a galaxy map, such associations can show up as a few galaxies aligned or clustered. This is expected. The disturbing element would not be alignment itself, but an association that is too massive or too rich relative to expected halo populations. A truly massive cluster deep in the core would be inconsistent with the idea of a deep mass under density unless the void boundary is defined too broadly. Therefore, when a surprise involves a group or dense patch of galaxies, the baseline question is whether it represents a high-mass halo population that is improbable given the void's mass deficit, or whether it is a modest halo association that is expected. At the diffuse gas layer, the baseline is that most baryons in the void are in a warm ionized intergalactic medium. The gas is illuminated by the ultraviolet background produced by galaxies, an active nuclei keeping hydrogen ionized over most of the volume. In low-density regions, recombination is slow, so the neutral fraction is very low. This makes void gas faint in emission. It is best detected through absorption lines in the spectra of background sources, where small neutral fractions can still produce measurable absorption. The baseline also expects that void gas is on average cooler than shock-heated gas in filaments, because strong shocks are less common, though there is still a range of temperatures. Ionization state and temperature together determine which absorption lines are detectable. The baseline predicts weaker and less frequent neutral hydrogen absorbers in the deepest void core compared with boundary regions, but not a total absence. Internal filaments and halo outskirts can still produce detectable absorbers. The baseline for metals in void gas is low average enrichment with scatter. Metals are produced in stars and distributed by outflows and winds. In voids, fewer galaxies mean fewer sources of metals. Therefore, metal lines are expected to be rarer and weaker. However, enrichment is not strictly local. Winds can travel farther in low-density environments, and over time metals can spread. Small faint galaxies within the void can also enrich their immediate surroundings. Therefore, occasional metal absorbers in the void are not anomalous. The anomaly would be a systematic level of enrichment, or a frequency of strong metal absorbers in the deep core that matches filament environments, especially if deep searches find no galaxies nearby. Such a pattern would challenge models of enrichment transport and halo occupation. Without such a pattern, metal detections remain consistent with baseline expectations. At the galaxy layer, the baseline is a sparse population dominated by low-mass galaxies, often gas-rich, often forming stars at low to moderate levels, and often with lower metallicities at fixed mass compared to denser environment galaxies. This follows from the halo distribution and from isolation. Environmental quenching mechanisms common in groups and clusters are weak or absent. Therefore, void galaxies can remain star-forming longer. Yet star formation efficiency can be low because molecular gas formation is less efficient at low metallicity and low density. This can lead to galaxies with substantial neutral hydrogen reservoirs, but modest star formation rates and diffuse stellar distributions. Low surface brightness systems are expected to be more common relative to dense environments, and their detectability depends on survey depth and pipeline choices. Therefore, the baseline galaxy census in Boötes depends on observational completeness. A bright galaxy sample will show strong emptiness. A deeper sample will reveal more dwarfs. Radio surveys can reveal gas-rich galaxies missed optically. None of these views contradict each other. They reveal different layers of the same baseline. This baseline also predicts specific relationships. In void galaxies, gas fraction tends to be higher at fixed stellar mass, and specific star formation rate tends to be higher on average, though, with scatter. Metallicity tends to be lower at fixed mass. The abundance of massive galaxies is reduced. The abundance of rich groups is reduced. If Boötes shows a population that violates these relationships in a systematic way, that is where a disturbing surprise could become a real modelling challenge. For example, if void galaxies are systematically quenched despite isolation, or if void gas is systematically metal-rich without nearby galaxies, or if a rich group exists deep in the core with a mass inconsistent with expected halo populations, these would be notable discrepancies. Yet each requires careful confirmation, because selection effects can mimic them. The baseline also includes internal substructure. Even in a large void, small-scale structure persists. There can be faint internal filaments, and galaxies can preferentially occupy these. Therefore, the presence of internal structure is not itself surprising. A disturbing surprise narrative often arises from an imagined void as a clean spherical emptiness. The baseline replaces that with a textured basin. The key question becomes quantitative: how much structure, How massive, how enriched, and how frequent compared to mock catalogues under match definitions. With this baseline interior stated, the next inward step is to examine the actual census of interior galaxies in the Boötes region, as it is assembled from surveys and follow-up focusing on how membership is assigned, which kinds of galaxies are found, and which aspects of the census are most likely to generate claims of a disturbing surprise. This step remains within observation and avoids foreshadowing by treating the census as the immediate interior layer that sits on top of the baseline expectations. The interior galaxy census of the Boötes void is the practical evidence most people have in mind when they speak of emptiness or surprise, because galaxies are the visible points in the map. The next inward region is therefore how that census is built, how membership is assigned, and what kinds of interior systems are typically found when the void is defined in a consistent way. In a void, the census is not a simple list. It is a layered construction shaped by survey depth, by the definition of the void boundary, and by the decision of what counts as core. Because the census is sparse, individual systems can carry disproportionate narrative weight. A single bright galaxy can seem like a startling intrusion. A small association can seem like an impossible cluster. A chain of dwarves can look like a filament that should not exist. The disciplined approach is to treat each apparent surprise as a question about classification and sampling before it becomes a question about physics. Membership begins with coordinates. A galaxy has position on the sky in a redshift. Under a chosen void definition, one can say whether that position lies within the void volume. But the void volume is defined in redshift space, and redshift includes peculiar velocity, so there is a built-in uncertainty along the line of sight. For most galaxies at these scales, the uncertainty is not large compared to the void size, but it matters near boundaries. A galaxy can be placed slightly deeper or slightly shallower depending on its peculiar motion. Therefore, a robust census often distinguishes between secure interior members and ambiguous edge members. Secure members are those that remain inside under small shifts in boundary or under alternative definitions. Edge members are those that can move in or out. Many perceived surprises occur among edge members, where the label inside the void can be sensitive to definition. Local environment provides a second membership filter. A galaxy can be geometrically inside the void, but still sit on a filamentary intrusion, where local density is higher than typical for the core. To address this, analysts often compute local density measures such as the distance to the third or fifth nearest neighbour in a volume-limited sample, or the value of the smooth density field at the galaxy's position. A galaxy may be called a void core galaxy only if the local density is below a threshold and the galaxy is within the void region. This approach helps isolate the truly isolated interior population. It also reframes surprises. A bright galaxy that appears inside the void may not be surprising if it sits on a local ridge or intrusion. A faint galaxy deep in a low-density region may be more representative of the core. Therefore, the census is not only about inside versus outside, but about gradients of density. The types of galaxies found in large void interiors generally align with the baseline. Many are low stellar mass systems. Many have disk-like morphologies. Many show ongoing star formation at low to moderate rates. Some are diffuse and low surface brightness. Their neutral hydrogen content can be high relative to their stellar mass. Their metallicities can be lower than those of similar mass galaxies in denser environments. These characteristics are consistent with isolation and with the slow growth of halos in underdense regions. They do not on their own constitute a disturbing surprise. If anything, they illustrate that a void is not a sterile region, but a low-density setting where small galaxies can persist. The census becomes more interesting when it includes systems that seem to sit at the upper end of what is expected. A relatively luminous galaxy, a substantial disk, or a small group can appear inside. The question then is whether the system is truly deep in the core and whether its inferred halo mass is high. In a void, luminous does not always mean massive halo. A galaxy can be relatively luminous for its environment, while still residing in a moderate halo. Stellar mass estimates, rotation curves, and group velocity dispersions help clarify this. If a system is found to be a genuinely massive halo deep in the core, that would be unusual, but such cases are vulnerable to misclassification. Often what looks like deep core is actually a direction where the boundary is farther out, or the system lies on an internal filament connected to the rim. Deep imaging can reveal faint companion galaxies tracing that connection. Redshift surveys that include faint galaxies can show that the system is not isolated in local density. Therefore, the census must be iterative updating as deeper data reveal additional structure. Sparse sampling also creates visual artifacts. In a region with few points, any small group of points looks significant. A chain of 3 or 4 galaxies can look like a filament. In the underlying mass field, internal filaments are expected, but the question is whether the observed chain is statistically consistent with that expectation. Mock catalogues can help here. One can measure the frequency of similar chains in void interiors under the same tracer selection. If chains are common, then the chain is not a surprise. If chains are rare, then the chain becomes a candidate anomaly. Yet because the number of interior galaxies is small, one must be careful about a posteriori selection. If a chain is noticed because it stands out visually, the look elsewhere effect applies. The correct test would define a chain statistic in advance and apply it across many voids or across many mock realizations. The faint end of the census can also drive surprising shifts. As surveys go deeper and become more sensitive to low surface brightness, the number of detected galaxies inside can increase. This does not necessarily erase the void because the surrounding regions also gain new detections, but it can change the internal density profile and can reveal that the void is less empty than earlier catalogues implied. This can feel like a disturbing surprise in reverse, as if the void is being filled in by hidden systems. In reality, it is the survey reaching closer to the true census. The new question becomes whether the abundance of faint galaxies in the core matches model predictions for halo occupation. If the void contains more faint galaxies, then predicted models may be suppressing star formation too strongly. If it contains fewer models, may be over-predicting luminous occupancy. Either way, the census becomes a constraint on baryonic modeling rather than an existential threat to the void concept. Radio detections add another census layer. Neutral hydrogen surveys can find gas-rich galaxies that are optically faint. In voids, these can be common relative to optical detection. A radio census can therefore reveal internal structure not seen in optical surveys. A disturbing surprise might be framed if radio surveys find an unexpectedly high concentration of gas-rich systems in the core, suggesting internal filaments richer than expected. Alternatively, the absence of gas-rich systems could be framed as surprising given isolation. In both cases, the baseline interpretation depends on survey sensitivity and on comparison to mocks and to control regions. The census also carries measurement uncertainty. Stellar masses depend on photometry and modelling of stellar populations. Star formation rates depend on tracers sensitive to different timescales and to dust. Metallicity depends on calibration. In void galaxies, low metallicity and low luminosity can push measurements into regimes where calibrations are less secure. Therefore, claims of extreme properties must be supported by careful measurement, and ideally by multiple independent indicators. In a calm view, the Boötes interior galaxy census is a sparse but real population dominated by low-mass systems, with occasional more prominent galaxies, and small associations embedded along faint internal structures. Many features that appear surprising at first become expected once membership is refined with local density measures, and once completeness is improved. The most meaningful place for a disturbing surprise to persist is not the existence of some galaxies, but a systematic mismatch in abundance or properties relative to matched simulations and control samples. That mismatch is most likely to show up in how star formation proceeds in isolation, and how gas is retained and converted into stars. The next inward step is therefore to examine star formation regulation in void galaxies and the specific observable signatures that could look disturbing if they deviate from model expectations. Star formation in the Boötes void is shaped less by dramatic external events and more by slow thresholds, whether gas can be acquired, whether it can cool, whether it can become molecular, and whether feedback cycles keep it bound. The next inward region is therefore the internal regulation of star formation in void galaxies, because this is where a disturbing surprise is most likely to be expressed as a quantitative mismatch. A void galaxy can look unexpectedly active because isolation preserves gas, or unexpectedly quiet because low metallicity suppresses molecular cloud formation, or unexpectedly bursty because feedback cycles dominate in shallow gravitational potentials. Each appearance can be consistent with baseline physics, but the balance among them is model dependent. In that balance, a pattern can emerge that either matches expectations or challenges them. The first regulator is gas supply. A galaxy forms stars only if its halo can bring in gas from the intergalactic medium and keep it from being stripped or evaporated. In the void, the external density is low, so ram pressure stripping and tidal interactions are weak. This favours gas retention. At the same time, halos are typically low mass, and low mass halos have difficulty accreting gas once the intergalactic medium is ionized by ultraviolet radiation. The ultraviolet background heats gas and increases its pressure, raising the threshold halo mass required for gas to fall in and cool. This creates a strong sensitivity to halo mass and formation history. Two halos of similar mass can have different star formation outcomes depending on when they assembled and how they interacted with the ultraviolet background. In the Boötes interior, where halo masses cluster near these thresholds, the visible galaxy population can be patchy. Some halos host gas-rich star-forming dwarfs. Others remain faint or dark. If models misestimate the threshold behavior, they can overpredict or underpredict the number of visible dwarfs in voids, making the observed population look like a disturbing mismatch. The second regulator is cooling, and the transition to the cold phase. Gas enters halos in a warm ionized state. To form stars, it must cool and condense into a cold, dense medium. Heavy elements aid cooling by providing additional ways to radiate energy. In low metallicity, gas cooling is less efficient. In low-density environments, gas densities in disks can be lower. Both factors make it harder for gas to reach the conditions needed for star formation. A key step is the formation of molecular hydrogen, the phase most closely associated with star-forming clouds. Molecular hydrogen forms efficiently on dust grains and survives when protected from ultraviolet light by shielding. Low metallicity implies low dust. Low dust implies less efficient molecular formation and less shielding. Therefore, a void galaxy can carry large amounts of atomic hydrogen while forming stars slowly because it struggles to build a molecular reservoir. This creates a recognizable observational pattern: high neutral hydrogen mass relative to stellar mass, extended low-intensity star formation, and low molecular gas content where it can be measured. If a Boötes interior sample shows unusually high gas fractions but modest star formation that is consistent with this baseline, if it shows unusually high star formation efficiency despite low metallicity and diffuse structure, that would be more surprising and would suggest either a different molecular formation pathway or a measurement bias. The third regulator is feedback. In low-mass galaxies, the energy injected by massive stars and supernovae can heat gas and drive outflows. Because the gravitational potential is shallow, outflows can remove a significant fraction of the interstellar medium, and can carry metals out of the galaxy. This tends to make star formation bursty. A galaxy forms stars in a burst, then feedback suppresses further star formation until gas cools and reaccretes. In an isolated void environment, this cycle may be less disturbed by external interaction, so burstiness can be a dominant feature of the star formation history. Observationally, this means star formation rate indicators that respond on different timescales can disagree. A galaxy might show strong emission lines if it is in a recent burst, yet its ultraviolet or optical color might reflect a longer-term average. It might appear unexpectedly active or unexpectedly inactive depending on which tracer is used. Therefore, a disturbing surprise claim based on star formation activity must specify the tracer, and must treat burstiness as an expected source of scatter. The fourth regulator is continued accretion and dilution. Even in a void, gas can continue to accrete along faint internal filaments, or as diffuse inflow. This inflow can be low in metallicity. When it enters a galaxy, it can dilute the metallicity of the interstellar medium. Therefore, void galaxies can have lower metallicities at fixed stellar mass than field galaxies, and they can show large scatter. Outflows can further lower metallicity by preferentially removing metal-enriched gas. The combined effect is that void galaxies can appear chemically young even at late times. If the Boötes interior contains galaxies with extremely low metallicities, relative to their mass and gas content that can be consistent with strong outflows and ongoing low metallicity inflow, it becomes disturbing only if the frequency of such extremes is far greater than models predict under matched selection. That would point to a gap in how models treat mixing outflow loading and accretion in low-density environments. The fifth regulator is the absence of environmental quenching. In dense environments, galaxies can be quenched by losing their gas or by losing their supply of fresh gas. In voids, these processes are weak. Therefore, one expects a higher fraction of star-forming galaxies among void dwarfs compared to denser environments at the same mass. A disturbing surprise would be the opposite, a void core population that is unusually quenched, gas-poor, or dominated by red systems, implying that internal feedback or the ultraviolet background suppresses star formation more strongly than expected, or that the galaxies formed early and exhausted their gas without replenishment. Such a pattern would require careful confirmation, because selection effects can favor the detection of star-forming galaxies through emission lines and can underdetect diffuse quenched dwarfs. Deep imaging and spectroscopy are needed to build a complete sample. When this regulation picture is applied to Boötes, the most likely scientific tension is not that star formation exists, but that its efficiency and variability may not match model predictions in the low-mass regime. Models calibrated in average environments may mispredict molecular formation thresholds, feedback strength and gas reaccretion rates in void halos. Therefore, a disturbing surprise can be translated into measurable population differences. The distribution of gas fractions, star formation efficiencies, specific star formation rates, and metallicities for void core galaxies compared to matched field or rim galaxies. If Boötes core galaxies systematically sit off the expected relationships, that becomes a constraint on baryonic physics. Star formation regulation also connects directly to the diffuse gas layer, because gas that is not turned into stars remains in the intergalactic medium, and metals produced in stars can be expelled into that medium. If the void's gas shows unexpected enrichment or unexpected absorber frequency, it can be linked to these feedback and outflow cycles. Therefore, the next inward step is to step away from the galaxies themselves and examine the void's diffuse gas as probed by absorption, focusing on what patterns are expected for a low-density ionized medium, and what patterns would genuinely count as a disturbing surprise when measured across multiple sightlines and compared to matched simulations. The diffuse gas of the Boötes void is the part that fills most of the volume and carries most of the baryons, yet it remains largely invisible except through subtle spectral signatures. The next inward region is therefore the intergalactic medium in the void and the absorption-based methods used to probe it, because this is where a disturbing surprise can feel most intense: metal-enriched gas, where few galaxies are seen, dense absorbers, where low density is expected, or an absence of expected absorption that suggests missing baryons. The baseline picture is quiet and consistent. Void gas is low density, highly ionized, and only weakly enriched on average. It is detectable mainly through absorption against bright background sources. The surprise becomes meaningful only when it is a systematic pattern rather than a single dramatic detection. Absorption work begins with a background light source, commonly a quasar. The quasar emits a bright continuum across ultraviolet and optical wavelengths. As that light travels toward the observer, it passes through intergalactic gas at many distances. Wherever there is neutral hydrogen, even at a small neutral fraction, the gas can absorb light at the hydrogen Lyman alpha wavelength in its rest frame. Because the gas is moving with the cosmic expansion, each absorbing region imprints a line shifted in wavelength. In the low redshift universe relevant to Boötes, the absorption forest is sparse enough that individual lines can often be resolved and measured, especially in high-quality spectra. The fundamental measured quantity is column density, the integrated number of atoms along the line of sight. For hydrogen, what is directly measured is neutral hydrogen column density. But in a photoionized medium, neutral hydrogen is only a tiny fraction of total hydrogen. Converting a neutral column into a total gas column requires modeling the ionization balance. That balance depends on gas density, temperature, and the intensity and spectrum of the ultraviolet background. In void, gas density is low, recombination is slow, and the neutral fraction is small. Therefore, the same total gas column produces weaker neutral absorption than it would in denser gas. This means two things. Weak absorption does not necessarily mean very little gas, and strong absorption implies either a higher density region, a cooler region, or gas associated with a halo or galaxy, rather than with a smooth void medium. Metal absorption lines add another layer. Metals such as carbon, oxygen, and silicon appear in different ionization states in the intergalactic medium. Detecting these lines indicates that the gas contains heavy elements produced by stars and distributed by outflows. In filaments and near galaxies, metal lines are relatively common. In void cores, the baseline expectation is that metal lines are rarer and weaker because there are fewer galaxies to enrich the gas. Yet metal lines can still appear for ordinary reasons. A faint dwarf galaxy below the optical detection limit can enrich its surroundings. An internal filament can host a small number of galaxies whose outflows enrich nearby gas. Metals can also travel farther in low-density environments because winds encounter less resistance. Over billions of years, this can distribute metals beyond the immediate vicinity of galaxies. Therefore, the existence of some metal absorption in the void is not anomalous. The disturbing surprise would be a frequency or strength of metal absorption in the deep core that approaches what is seen in filament environments, especially if deep galaxy searches find no nearby galaxies down to stringent limits. The number of sightlines is a critical limitation. A void spans a vast area, but absorption probes are pencil beams. A single quasar spectrum samples a narrow path. Even if the void core is mostly smooth low-density gas, a sightline can still intersect an internal filament, or the outskirts of a halo producing relatively strong absorption. With only a few sightlines, such chance intersections can dominate perception. This is why robust statements about void gas typically require many sightlines, and often stacking across many voids to build statistics. For Boötes, any claim about a disturbing gas surprise should be treated as provisional unless the sampling is dense enough to estimate absorber frequency and strength distributions. Ionization modelling is another source of uncertainty that can produce apparent surprises. Metallicity estimates often depend on assumptions about the ultraviolet background and on the ionization parameter, which relates ionizing photon density to gas density. If the assumed background is too strong or too weak, the inferred density and metallicity change. Temperature also matters because collisional ionization can contribute in warmer gas. Therefore, reliable metallicity inference requires multiple detected ions that constrain the ionization state. Without such constraints, a derived high metallicity in a void absorber can be an artifact of assumed conditions. A careful analysis reports what is well constrained and what remains uncertain without speculation. Associating absorbers with galaxies is also challenging in voids. To decide whether an absorber is truly intergalactic void gas or part of a galaxy's extended halo, observers search for galaxies near the absorber's redshift and near the line of sight in projected distance. In dense regions, there are often many candidates. In voids, there may be none above standard detection thresholds. Yet faint and low surface brightness galaxies can be missed unless targeted searches are deep. Therefore, the absence of a known galaxy association is not decisive unless the search is deep and complete. A disturbing surprise claim that relies on a lack of nearby galaxies must specify the depth and completeness of the galaxy search. If deep imaging and spectroscopy still find no galaxies within a large radius, then an enriched absorber becomes more interesting because it implies metals and gas not obviously tied to any galaxy. There is also the possibility of a different kind of surprise, a deficit of absorption. If models predict a certain frequency of weak hydrogen absorbers, even in void cores based on the expected baryon density and ionization, and if observations find significantly fewer absorbers than expected, it could suggest that the void gas is more highly ionized, or hotter, reducing neutral fractions, or that baryons are distributed differently than assumed. However, detection completeness must be modelled. Weak absorbers can be missed in noisy spectra. Therefore, an apparent deficit can be a sensitivity issue. The remedy is to use spectra with known signal to noise and to quantify detection limits as a function of wavelength and line width. In a calm interpretation, the diffuse gas layer provides a powerful but delicate test. The Boötes void should contain ionized gas with low neutral fractions and low average metal enrichment. Strong absorbers and metal lines can still occur due to internal filaments, halo outskirts, or faint galaxies. The disturbing surprise becomes credible only if there is a systematic excess or deficit of absorbers in the core, relative to matched simulations supported by multiple sightlines and by deep galaxy searches that rule out hidden associations. With void gas described as the volume-filling medium, the next inward step is to return to the invisible mass layer and clarify how dark matter and luminous traces separate inside a void. This separation determines whether the void is extreme in mass or merely extreme in bright galaxies. It also sets the stage for evaluating claims that the void does not fit any model, because only mass-level evidence can support a true cosmological tension, while tracer-level evidence often points to bias and galaxy formation physics. The most common misunderstanding behind a void surprise is the assumption that the map of luminous galaxies is the map of matter. In reality, the luminous map is a filtered view of matter, shaped by bias and by the physics of galaxy formation. The next inward region is therefore the separation between dark matter structure and visible traces in the Boötes void, because this separation determines whether a disturbing surprise has cosmological weight or is instead a statement about how galaxies occupy halos. A void can appear extreme in a bright galaxy survey while remaining moderate in mass. A void can host hidden halos and faint systems that are invisible in standard catalogues. Only by keeping these layers distinct can confusion be reduced. At the mass level, the baseline prediction is a continuous matter field with fluctuations. Dark matter provides most of the mass and sets the gravitational potential. In simulations, voids are regions where the matter density is below average, but they are not empty. The density deficit is smooth on large scales and textured on small scales. Halos form wherever the density is high enough locally for collapse, and in voids that condition is met primarily for low-mass halos. High-mass halos are strongly suppressed because forming them requires sustained accretion and merging, which is less available in underdense regions. This is a robust expectation. Therefore, the absence of massive galaxies and rich groups in the deepest void interior is expected. The presence of many low-mass halos is also expected, though those halos may not host detectable galaxies. The mapping from halos to galaxies is described by halo occupation. Halo occupation is not one number. It depends on halo mass, on assembly history, on gas accretion, and on feedback. In the low-mass regime relevant to void interiors, the occupation becomes uncertain and threshold-like. Below a certain halo, mass gas cannot cool and form stars efficiently under the ionizing background. Below another scale, feedback can expel gas so efficiently that star formation remains extremely low. As a result, many halos may host galaxies that are too faint to detect or no stars at all. In dense environments, observational samples often constrain halo occupation well, because there are many galaxies and many clustering measurements. In voids, the constraints are weaker. This is why a void can seem to reveal something disturbing. It probes the part of the halo population where the mapping to light is least certain. A mismatch between observed void galaxy counts and model predictions is often a mismatch in halo occupation and feedback, not a mismatch in the underlying mass field. Bias amplifies this effect. Bright galaxies are strongly biased toward dense regions because they reside in massive halos. Therefore, a void defined by bright galaxies can appear extremely empty, even if the mass deficit is moderate. The term galaxy bias is not a philosophical idea. It is a measurable relationship between galaxy clustering and matter clustering. In a void interior, the bias of the remaining visible galaxies can also be different because the sample is dominated by particular types, such as gas-rich dwarfs or star-forming systems. Therefore, interpreting galaxy density as mass density in the void can be misleading. Any disturbing surprise that begins with a galaxy map must ask whether it is a surprise in bias rather than a surprise in mass. Because mass is not directly visible, one needs probes that respond to gravity rather than to light. Weak gravitational lensing is the most direct in principle. A mass deficit produces a small coherent distortion in the shapes of background galaxies. The signal for a single void is typically weak, and stacking is often required to achieve clear detection. Yet the conceptual role remains important. If lensing suggests that the mass deficit associated with Boötes is moderate, then the dramatic emptiness in bright galaxies is interpreted as tracer bias and halo occupation effects. If lensing suggests an unusually deep mass deficit, the case for cosmological tension strengthens. In many real scenarios, lensing constraints may be broad, but even broad constraints can limit extreme interpretations. Dynamics provides another gravity-sensitive route. The mass deficit drives an outflow velocity field. Galaxies around the void show redshift space distortions linked to this outflow. By measuring anisotropy in the galaxy distribution around the void, one can infer a velocity profile, and through models, a mass profile. This inference depends on tracer bias and on the void definition, but it provides a self-consistency test. A void that looks extreme in galaxy density but shows modest dynamical outflow is likely moderate in mass. A void that shows strong outflow could be deeper in mass. This distinction matters because a truly disturbing surprise that does not fit any model would require a mass-level discrepancy, not merely a tracer-level extremeness. There is also the internal halo population to consider. Even if massive halos are rare, the void can contain many low-mass halos. If those halos host faint galaxies, deep surveys can reveal them. If they host dark galaxies, they remain unseen but still contribute to mass. A surprising claim might be that the void contains too few galaxies even at very faint thresholds, implying that many halos are dark. That would be a statement about star formation suppression. Or a claim might be that the void contains too many faint galaxies, implying that star formation is less suppressed than models assume. Both possibilities are plausible and testable. Neither automatically challenges cosmology. They challenge baryonic prescriptions. A cosmological challenge would arise if the inferred mass deficit or the distribution of halos in the void is inconsistent with the statistics of the initial density field given the survey volume. Another aspect of the mass-light separation is the difference between void defined in the mass field and void defined in galaxies. In simulations, voids in the mass field can be identified directly by density. These voids have certain size and depth distributions. Voids in galaxy fields, however, are larger and deeper for biased traces. Therefore, comparing an observed galaxy-defined void to a mass-defined void distribution can make it look too extreme. The correct comparison uses galaxy mocks, not mass voids. This is a frequent source of confusion in public narratives. A disturbing surprise may be created simply by comparing the wrong distributions. Even within the galaxy-defined void, the separation matters for interpreting interior structures. A sparse chain of galaxies can trace an internal filament that corresponds to a modest ridge in the mass field. The ridge can be real, even if it is not prominent in bright galaxies. A small group can exist without implying a massive cluster. Therefore, the presence of some structure does not violate the void concept. The relevant question is whether the structure implies a mass concentration incompatible with the void's mass deficit. This requires mass estimates of the system, such as dynamics within the group rather than visual impression. In a calm baseline, the Boötes void is a region where bright galaxies are rare, and where mass density is below average, containing many low-mass halos and diffuse ionized gas. A disturbing surprise that claims model failure must show that the mass deficit and halo population are inconsistent with the standard statistical expectations under match selection. Without that, the surprise is more likely to be a tension in the mapping from mass to light. That tension is still scientifically valuable, because voids probe the low-mass regime of galaxy formation. With the mass versus light separation clarified, the next inward step is to examine the observational methods that can act as referees between these layers, particularly dynamics and lensing in the context of a void. This will focus on how outflow patterns and shear measurements can constrain mass deficit, and whether those constraints can support or dissolve a claim that the Boötes interior contains something disturbing beyond what models expect. Dynamics and lensing are the closest things to a referee in a void because they respond to gravity rather than to brightness. The next inward region is therefore how the Boötes void can be tested through the motion of galaxies and through weak gravitational lensing, and how those tests can clarify whether a disturbing surprise is a true mass-level discrepancy or a tracer-level illusion. Both approaches are difficult for a single void, because signals are subtle and because void geometry is irregular, but even imperfect constraints can narrow interpretations. The aim is not to force a dramatic conclusion. It is to establish whether the mass deficit implied by the void is consistent with what the galaxy map suggests once bias is considered, and whether any interior feature implies more mass than the void can reasonably contain. The dynamic signature begins with the void outflow. In the standard picture, matter and galaxies flow outward from the under-dense interior toward denser regions. This flow produces a peculiar velocity field superposed on the cosmic expansion. In redshift surveys, distances are inferred from redshift, so peculiar velocities distort the apparent positions of galaxies along the line of sight. The result is an anisotropic pattern in the distribution of galaxies around void centers known as redshift space distortion. If the void were observed in true comoving space, the average density profile around the center would be isotropic when averaged over many directions. In redshift space, it becomes anisotropic because line-of-sight distances are perturbed by velocities. To measure this, analysts compute statistics such as the void galaxy cross-correlation function, separating distances parallel and perpendicular to the line of sight. The shape of this function encodes information about the velocity profile. The velocity profile is linked to the mass density profile through gravitational theory. In the linear regime and beyond the outflow speed at a given radius depends on how underdense the interior is and on how mass is distributed near the boundary. A void with a strong compensation ridge can have a different velocity gradient than a void that is undercompensated. Therefore, dynamics provides information not just about the central deficit, but about how the void transitions into the surrounding web. For a single prominent void like Boötes, the measurement is constrained by tracer density. The interior contains few galaxies, so the statistics rely heavily on boundary and near-boundary galaxies. This means the inferred velocities reflect the outer profile more than the deep core, yet that is still informative. If the galaxy-defined profile suggests an extremely deep deficit, but the measured anisotropy indicates only modest outflow that supports the view that the extremeness is primarily in the tracer layer. If the anisotropy indicates strong outflow consistent with a deep deficit, the mass-level interpretation strengthens. In both cases, the analysis must model tracer bias, survey selection, and void asphericity. Without those, a mismatch can appear where none exists. Void asphericity is especially relevant for Boötes. A single void is not spherical and not isolated. Its boundary distances vary by direction, and nearby overdensities exert tidal influences that can distort the velocity field. A spherical model may fit the average profile poorly. Therefore, a careful dynamic test either focuses on a spherically average component with appropriate uncertainties or uses simulations to create analog voids with similar environment and then compares statistics. The practical outcome is often a range of mass profiles consistent with the observed anisotropy rather than a single sharp value. Even a range can be useful if it excludes very deep mass deficits. Weak gravitational lensing offers a complementary approach. Lensing measures the deflection of light by mass. A void produces a characteristic lensing signal background. Galaxies appear slightly less sheared toward the center, compared to the surroundings reflecting a projected mass deficit. The signal is small because the void's density contrast, while significant, is spread over a large scale, and because the shear induced is weak. Noise arises from the intrinsic ellipticity of background galaxies and from measurement systematics. Therefore, lensing of voids is often measured by stacking many voids. For a single void, detection can be marginal, but an analysis can still provide constraints if the void is large and if the background galaxy density and shape measurement quality are high. The lensing test has two roles. First, it provides a direct estimate of the projected mass deficit independent of galaxy bias. Second, it can be compared to the density profile inferred from the galaxy distribution. If lensing suggests that the mass deficit is moderate, then the low galaxy density is interpreted as bias and occupation effects. If lensing suggests a deeper deficit than galaxy density would indicate, then bias modeling may be wrong, or the void may be deeper in mass than assumed. Such a discrepancy could motivate deeper investigation. Lensing also helps assess whether a strong compensation ridge exists, because a ridge would contribute positively to the projected mass near the boundary, and could alter the lensing profile shape. Lensing and dynamics can be combined. Dynamics responds to the three-dimensional potential and growth rate, while lensing responds to projected mass. Together they can constrain void profiles more robustly, and can reduce degeneracies with bias. In practice, for Boötes, combining them would likely yield broad constraints, unless data quality and coverage are excellent, but broad constraints can still limit extreme interpretations that underlie disturbing surprise narratives. A disturbing surprise can also be tested by focusing on specific interior structures. If an interior galaxy association is claimed to be too massive for the void, one can estimate its mass from internal dynamics, such as galaxy velocity dispersion, or from other mass proxies where available. One then asks whether such a halo could exist in the void core given the inferred mass deficit and halo mass function. If the association is modest in mass, it can be consistent with baseline expectations. If it is genuinely massive membership, an environment must be checked carefully, because a massive halo is more likely to sit on a filament connected to the rim than to be isolated in the deepest core. If lensing and dynamics indicate a moderate mass deficit that further constrains how massive an interior structure can plausibly be without making the void inconsistent. The main systematics in these referee methods are similar. Survey geometry and selection can bias dynamic measurements. Shape measurement systematics and photometric redshift uncertainties can bias lensing. Both require careful modelling and validation on mocks. In a sparse void shot noise can be severe. Therefore, a credible claim of mass-level anomaly requires that the analysis shows robustness to these systematics, not merely a best-fit mismatch. In the calm view, dynamics and lensing are the measurements that can most directly decide whether the Boötes void contains something disturbing in the mass sense. They can show whether the void is simply an extreme tracer void or an unusually deep mass under density. They can also constrain whether interior structures imply too much mass. Often the outcome is that the void is dramatic in luminous tracers, but moderate in mass, and the surprise is redirected toward the physics of galaxy formation in low-mass halos and toward the completeness of faint and diffuse galaxy surveys. With the referee methods laid out, the next inward step is to identify the systematics that most commonly mimic mass-level surprises in voids, because even a careful lensing or dynamic measurement can be misled by survey edges, completeness, gradients, center, definitions, and covariance underestimation. Before a disturbing surprise can be treated as a physical discrepancy, it must survive these systematic stress tests in the context of the Boötes region's large angular footprint and sparse interior. In a void, the line between a mass-level surprise and a measurement artifact is thin because the signals are subtle, and the data are shaped by survey design. The next inward region is therefore the set of systematics that can mimic a disturbing surprise when using dynamics and lensing as referees and the practical checks that keep interpretations anchored. These systematics do not imply that void measurements are unreliable. They imply that void measurements require explicit stress testing, especially for a single named void with a large sky footprint like Boötes, where edge effects, depth variations, and sparse sampling can matter. Survey footprint effects are the first systematic. A void's boundary can approach the edge of a survey's observed region. If the void finding algorithm does not treat edges correctly, it can allow the void to spill into unobserved space, making it appear larger and emptier. Even if the void is real, edge proximity can bias its center, elongate its apparent shape, and distort radial profiles. For dynamics, this can induce anisotropy that looks like redshift space distortion, when it is actually missing data in one direction. For lensing, edge proximity can complicate background galaxy selection and mask correction. The basic check is to recompute the void definition and the key statistics after trimming regions near survey edges and after applying alternative edge handling methods. If the void core and its inferred properties remain stable, confidence increases. If they shift strongly, the surprise may be a footprint artifact. Depth variations across the sky are a second systematic. Imaging depth and spectroscopic completeness can vary with observing conditions and strategy. A shallower patch produces fewer detected galaxies, which can deepen a void artificially. Even when a void is genuine depth, variations can bias the inferred density profile. For dynamics, depth variations can create apparent gradients in galaxy density that align with the line of sight or with survey scanning patterns, contaminating anisotropy measurements. For lensing depth variations change the number density of usable background galaxies, which can change signal to noise and can imprint spatially varying systematics into shear maps. The check is to use survey systematics maps such as seeing sky brightness exposure time and stellar density, and to demonstrate that the void region does not correlate with those maps in a way that could produce the observed underdensity. Random catalogues and completeness weights must encode these variations. If a disturbing surprise depends on a region that also has systematically worse depth, the interpretation must be revised. Void center definition is a third systematic and can strongly affect dynamics and lensing. A void center can be defined as the center of a maximal empty sphere, the location of the lowest density minimum, or the volume-weighted centroid of a connected basin. These centers can differ significantly in an aspherical void. Dynamics and lensing profiles measured around different centers can differ, and a poor center choice can produce a profile that looks inconsistent with expectations. In addition, in redshift space, peculiar velocities can shift the apparent location of density minima. Therefore, a robust analysis tests multiple center definitions and reports whether the inferred mass profile is stable. If an anomaly appears only for one center definition, it may be a centering artifact. Boundary definition and compensation are a fourth systematic. Dynamics depends on the density gradient and on mass distribution near the boundary. If the void boundary is defined too broadly, including regions that are not strongly underdense, the inferred density deficit becomes shallower and the expected outflow weaker. The observed anisotropy might then appear too strong, creating a false impression of anomalous dynamics. Conversely, if the boundary is defined too narrowly, focusing only on the deepest core, the expected outflow might be overestimated relative to the boundary-dominated measurement. Lensing is also sensitive to boundary, because the projected signal includes contributions from both the deficit and any compensation ridge. Misestimating ridge strength can lead to misinterpretation of lensing profiles. The check is to measure profiles at multiple radii to use mock catalogues that replicate the void-finding procedure, and to fit models that allow for a range of ridge strengths consistent with simulations. Redshift space distortions have their own systematics. Peculiar velocities within groups and clusters near the void rim can stretch structures along the line of sight, creating fingers of galaxies that intrude into the void in redshift space. These can be mistaken for interior structure and can bias density profiles. At the same time, coherent outflows can shift galaxies near the boundary in or out of the void volume. Therefore, interpreting membership in redshift space requires caution near the rim. Dynamic analyses must model these distortions rather than treating redshift space as a direct map of real space. The check is to use simulations transformed into redshift space and to apply the same void definition and measurement in that space, ensuring that the comparison baseline includes the same distortions. Shot noise and covariance underestimation are another major source of apparent surprise. In a sparse interior density, estimates are noisy. A small number of galaxies can create large fractional changes. For dynamics, anisotropy measurements rely on counts in bins, and in low-count regimes the errors are non-Gaussian. If one assumes Gaussian errors and ignores bin correlations, best-fit parameters can appear more precise than they are, making a discrepancy look significant when it is not. For lensing, shape noise dominates and covariance depends on survey geometry and on background galaxy selection. Underestimating covariance can create apparent significant detections or discrepancies. The check is to estimate covariance using mock catalogues, bootstrap or jackknife methods, and to verify stability of results under alternative binning and weighting choices. Background galaxy selection for lensing introduces additional systematics. Lensing requires a clean separation between foreground structures and background sources. Photometric redshift errors can leak foreground galaxies into the background sample, diluting the lensing signal. Spatial variations in photometric redshift quality can create artificial shear patterns. Shear measurement algorithms can be sensitive to seeing and to detector effects. These are controlled through calibration and null tests. A void lensing analysis must show that shear around random positions does not produce a similar signal, and that the signal changes as expected when background selection criteria are varied. Without these tests, a lensing-based surprise can be a measurement artifact. Asphericity and environmental tides are the last major systematic for a single named void. The velocity field and mass distribution are not spherically symmetric. Fitting a spherical model can yield residuals that look like anomalies. A void can be elongated along a particular axis due to nearby overdensities. If that axis aligns with the line of sight, it can produce enhanced anisotropy, unrelated to outflow magnitude. The check is to measure profiles in angular sectors to model asphericity explicitly, or to compare to simulated analogues with similar shapes and environments. This reframes the question from whether the void is anomalous to whether the model used to interpret it is appropriate. These systematics collectively explain why scientific discussions can sound confused. Analysts may be focusing on different definitions, different center choices, different traces or different corrections, each yielding slightly different profiles, and therefore different conclusions about what is surprising. The discipline pathway is to present the void definition, the tracer selection, the completeness modeling, and the systematics tests as part of the claim itself. An anomaly claim that does not include these stress tests is not yet a physical claim. It is a preliminary observation, with systematics defined and the need for stress tests established. The next inward step is to place any remaining disturbing surprise in statistical context. Even after systematics control, a rare void or a rare interior feature can exist as an expected extreme in a large survey. The question becomes one of probability under matched definitions, including the look elsewhere effect that arises from scanning large volumes for the most striking underdensity. After definitions are fixed and systematics are stressed, the remaining question is statistical. How rare is what is being seen under a matched measurement pipeline? And is that rarity greater than what should be expected somewhere in the surveyed universe? The next inward region is therefore probability, because a disturbing surprise often feels like an impossibility when it is actually an expected extreme selected by attention. The Boötes void is named and remembered because it is striking. That selection changes the probability problem. The correct question is not whether a random region of space should contain such a void. The correct question is whether a survey that covers a large volume should contain at least one void of comparable extremeness when the same tracer selection and void finding rules are applied. The first statistical ingredient is cosmic variance. The universe is described by a statistical model of initial fluctuations, but any finite survey observes one particular realization. In that realization, some rare features will occur and some will not. The variance in the number and properties of large voids across different survey volumes can be substantial. This variance is larger for rarer, larger structures. Therefore, the appearance of a prominent void in a given survey is not itself evidence of model failure. It is a data point that must be compared to the distribution of outcomes in mock surveys of the same volume and selection. If mocks commonly contain at least one prominent void, then the observed void is expected as part of variance. The second ingredient is the look elsewhere effect. When an analyst or an entire community looks at a three-dimensional map and asks what is the most empty region, that question implicitly includes many trials. There are many possible centers and many possible scales. A void-finding algorithm searches over this space of possibilities. Even if the probability that a given location contains an extremely empty region is small, the probability that the survey contains at least one such region can be much larger when one accounts for the number of effective trials. This is especially relevant for a named void because it is often the outcome of such a search, either explicit or informal. Therefore, rarity must be computed for the maximum void in a survey, not for a void at a predetermined location. If one ignores this, one can overstate tension. The third ingredient is definition dependence. The extremeness of a void depends on tracer choice and on void definition. A void defined in a bright galaxy sample can be far deeper and larger than a void defined in a faint galaxy sample. The distribution of void sizes and depths therefore changes with selection. If one compares an observed bright tracer void to a theoretical distribution of mass voids, it will appear too extreme. The correct comparison is to a distribution of voids found in mock galaxy catalogues with the same tracer selection, completeness, and void finder. When this is done, many apparent anomalies become consistent. Therefore, a disturbing surprise claim must be anchored to a matched definition baseline. Otherwise, the surprise is partly a mismatch in what is being compared. Joint distributions matter as well. A void has multiple correlated properties: effective radius, central density, contrast, ellipticity, ridge strength, and environment. A void that is large in effective radius may not be extremely deep in mass. A void that is deep in tracer density may be only moderately deep in mass. A void can be elongated due to environment. Therefore, evaluating extremeness using a single number can be misleading. The correct test uses joint distributions from mocks. A void might be in the tail for size, but typical for depth or vice versa. A disturbing surprise should be formulated in terms of the specific combination of properties that is claimed to be inconsistent, because that combination is what must be found rare in the joint distribution. Interior features face the same logic. A single unusual galaxy in the void core can feel impossible because the core is sparse. But if one surveys enough volume and enough voids, unusual galaxies exist somewhere, and some will fall in void interiors by chance. The correct probability question conditions on the sample size and on the selection. If the unusual galaxy is chosen because it stands out, then one must account for the selection bias. A robust approach defines the criterion in advance, such as galaxies above a certain stellar mass within void cores, and then measures the frequency of such galaxies in the data and in mocks. A similar approach applies to absorber surprises. A strong absorber in a void core can be rare for a random sightline, but if many sightlines are examined, at least one strong absorber may be expected. The significance depends on the number of trials. The survey volume itself sets the context. A void of a certain size is rarer in a smaller volume, and more likely in a larger volume. Therefore, quoting a probability without referencing the survey volume is incomplete. In addition, surveys often have complex geometry. The effective volume for detecting voids of a given size depends on the footprint and on edge cuts. Mocks that replicate the exact geometry are therefore necessary. Only then can one say whether Boötes is a typical extreme or an outlier beyond expectation. In the calm view, statistical context does not dilute interest. It refines it. If Boötes lies within the expected tail under matched mocks, then it becomes a valuable laboratory for testing galaxy formation and gas physics in low-density environments, not a contradiction. If it lies beyond, then the next question is whether the mismatches in cosmological parameters, in assumptions about initial fluctuation statistics, or in measurement. Even then, because void statistics can be sensitive to bias and selection, one must be cautious about attributing the mismatch to fundamental physics. A mass-level discrepancy supported by lensing and dynamics would carry more weight than a tracer-level discrepancy. A disturbing surprise can therefore be recast as one of three statistical statements. First, the void is extreme but expected as the maximum in the survey, and the surprise is psychological rather than physical. Second, the void is rarer than expected in the tracer distribution under current galaxy formation models, implying a need to adjust halo occupation and feedback prescriptions. Third, the void is rarer than expected in the mass distribution under standard cosmology, implying a possible tension that requires independent mass probes and careful probability assessment. The first is common, the second is plausible and scientifically productive, the third is rare and demanding. With this statistical region clarified, the next inward step is to identify the most decisive measurements that can move the interpretation from narrative and probability to constraint, especially measurements that directly test whether the claimed disturbing surprise is in mass and gas enrichment or in galaxy occupation. These measurements must be defined in a way that can be applied to both data and matched mock surveys, so that the result is a comparison rather than a story. The most decisive way to settle a disturbing surprise in the Boötes void is to choose measurements that each target a different layer of the void problem, and that can be reproduced in both real surveys and matched mock catalogues. The next inward region is therefore a measurement program stated in calm, testable terms, moving from tracer completeness to galaxy properties, to diffuse gas to gravity, because each layer can generate apparent surprises, and each layer has a specific observation that can either confirm a real discrepancy or dissolve it. The emphasis is on what can be known and compared, and on keeping each result tied to the definition of the void used to claim the surprise. The first decisive measurement is a stable void definition with quantified completeness. The void must be redefined in a volume-limited sample with a clear luminosity or stellar mass threshold within a specified redshift range using a void finder whose behavior near masks and survey edges is validated on mocks. Alongside this, a completeness model must be provided that maps the probability of detecting and obtaining redshifts for galaxies as a function of sky position brightness and surface brightness. This is not merely procedural. It is the baseline against which emptiness is measured. If the disturbing surprise is framed as extreme emptiness, the emptiness should be expressed as a density contrast profile with uncertainties derived from mocks and resampling. The outcome can then be compared to the distribution of maximum void properties in mocks. If Boötes falls within the tail expected for the maximum void, the surprise in emptiness becomes a known extreme rather than a contradiction. The second decisive measurement is a low surface brightness and faint dwarf census targeted at the void core. This requires deep imaging with detection pipelines tuned to diffuse light and careful treatment of sky subtraction, because errors in sky modelling can erase low surface brightness systems. Candidate galaxies require redshifts which may require sensitive spectroscopy or alternative distance indicators. The core region should be defined by a local density criterion, as well as by global void membership so that the census truly targets the deepest interior. The key statistic is the luminosity function and stellar mass function in the core compared to the rim corrected for completeness. If the core contains a substantial population of faint systems, the void remains underdense in bright traces, but is less empty in total galaxy counts. The surprise shifts from emptiness to the efficiency of star formation in low-mass halos. If the core remains sparse even for faint and diffuse galaxies, the tracer emptiness becomes more robust and more demanding on halo occupation models. The third decisive measurement is neutral hydrogen mapping across the void. Gas-rich galaxies can be optically faint, so a radiocensus provides an independent tracer of low-mass systems. The key outcomes are the abundance of neutral hydrogen detections in the core, the distribution of gas fractions at fixed stellar mass, and the spatial pattern of gas-rich systems relative to any internal filamentary structure. These statistics compared to rim controls and to mocks, processed through a survey selection model, constrain whether void galaxies retain gas as expected, and whether star formation efficiency is unusually high or low. A disturbing surprise could become concrete if, for example, the core hosts far more extremely gas-rich dwarfs than models predict, or if it hosts far fewer, implying stronger suppression of baryon capture. The fourth decisive measurement is a consistent set of star formation and metallicity diagnostics for the void core galaxies. Star formation rates should be derived using tracers with understood timescales and corrected for dust as appropriate. Metallicity should be derived using consistent calibration methods and, where possible, multiple line diagnostics to reduce systematic offsets. The key is not a single extreme value, but the population distribution compared to rim galaxies at the same stellar mass. If void core galaxies systematically show higher specific star formation rates and lower metallicities that supports baseline expectations, if they show the opposite, or if their distributions have tails far beyond what models and controls show, then the surprise becomes a constraint on feedback and chemical evolution in isolation. The fifth decisive measurement is a densified absorption sightline program through the core to probe diffuse gas. Multiple background quasars and bright background galaxies should be used to sample different lines of sight, building a statistical picture rather than relying on one sightline. Hydrogen absorption frequency and column density distributions should be measured with detection completeness modelled. Metal line detections should be used to infer metallicities with ionization modelling constrained by multiple ions where possible. In parallel, deep galaxy searches around each sightline should be conducted to identify faint associations. A disturbing surprise would become credible if the core shows a systematic excess of metal-enriched absorbers with no associated galaxies down to deep limits, implying more widespread enrichment than expected, or if it shows an unexpected deficit of even weak hydrogen absorbers, implying a different ionization or thermal state. The sixth decisive measurement is gravitational inference through dynamics and, where feasible, lensing. Redshift space distortions around the void should be measured with careful treatment of center definitions, asphericity and covariance, and compared to mock predictions that include the same tracer bias and selection. Weak lensing, even if low signal, can constrain the projected mass deficit, and can test whether the void is extreme in mass or primarily extreme in luminous traces. The crucial outcome is whether mass-sensitive probes support a mass deficit consistent with standard expectations for a void of this size in the survey volume. If mass probes indicate a moderate deficit, the disturbing surprise is redirected away from cosmology. If they indicate an unusually deep deficit, the claim becomes more substantial and demands careful statistical testing against matched cosmological simulations. When these measurements are integrated, the Boötes void becomes less a stage for a vague surprise and more a structured experiment. The void can remain dramatic in bright galaxy maps, while being consistent in mass, implying that the surprise is in the mapping from halos to light. The void can reveal unexpected patterns in gas enrichment, pointing to gaps in how models treat outflows and mixing in low-density environments. Or more rarely, the void can show a mass profile that is unusually deep and rare, motivating scrutiny of cosmological assumptions and of survey selection. Each of these outcomes is compatible with calm reporting, because each is a comparison of measured distributions to predicted distributions under matched definitions. By the time the analysis reaches this layer, the disturbing part of the surprise is narrowed. It is no longer the idea that something exists inside a void. It is the possibility that the measured distributions do not align with the distributions produced by the best available models under the same observational conditions. That is the kind of surprise that can be addressed with additional data and improved modelling without exaggeration, and without needing to imply impossibility. The Boötes void remains a quiet test of how the universe looks when density is low. Its most striking quality in bright galaxy maps is not a gap in existence, but a gap in what the selected tracers choose to show. When deeper imaging radio surveys and absorption sightlines are placed over the same volume, the interior tends to reveal a thin but coherent set of ordinary processes. Gas drifting along faint internal structure, small halos holding onto cold reservoirs and slow star formation that leaves galaxies dim and spread out. In that setting, a disturbing surprise is most often a mismatch between layers. A galaxy census can suggest a depth that dynamics does not support, Absorption can imply enrichment where optical catalogues show no galaxies. A few detected systems can look exceptional because the missing faint population is still below the surface brightness limit. Each mismatch is a question that can be answered by defining the void, precisely measuring completeness and comparing like with like in simulated surveys. If a surprise persists after that discipline, it becomes narrower and more useful. It becomes a statement about thresholds in low-mass halos, about how molecular gas forms when dust is scarce, about how often feedback expels metals beyond the halo, and about how the ultraviolet background sets the quiet floor under galaxy formation. Or it becomes a statement about the mass deficit itself tested by lensing and by redshift space distortions, and placed in the correct probability frame for the most extreme void in a finite survey. The story then returns to what the void is best at revealing, not a break in the cosmic rules, but the regions where those rules are hardest to measure, and where models are most sensitive to small changes in physics.